I started trying to compose music when I was about 10 years old, about 1988. So I've been around, I've been doing this for a while. And when I first tried to compose music, I didn't know how to notate anything. I didn't really play an instrument very well, and my mom had a piano, and so I would just kind of sit at the piano and play different sounds that I liked, and I had no idea about the concept of a triad. And so I started in a very experimental way learning to compose music. As I got a little bit older in high school, my dad actually bought me a music notation program called Encore. And this program allowed me to actually start inputting notes into the computer. And this is something that a lot of composers tell you never to do. They say do not use a notation program. I personally think that when it comes to experimentation and learning the ropes of music composition in the beginning stages, a notation program can be helpful. The thing that I learned that if you stack notes on lines or spaces, adjacent lines or spaces, it created these pleasing sounds that worked well. And so I would kind of do that and try and connect these chords that I was creating with a melody that I'd come up with. So obviously, as I continued to study, I continued to get better. I started to learn how to read music, and I drifted away from the notation program. When I was in college especially, my professor told me, you have to get away from using any sort of notation program. Use the piano. And so I would sit at the piano and I would experiment with different chords and progressions and things of that nature. He was talking to me about this, and I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to get away from the notation program. It was kind of a crutch, and I started to learn how to compose with the piano. As I developed further, I started to learn how to improvise, and he started to talk to me about this idea of audiating the music you were hearing. And I remember one day I was walking on campus with him towards our student union, and he was asking me how the voices in my head were going. And we were having this conversation in public. I told him, well, they're starting to get better. So he was working with me a little bit about audiation, but he didn't really give me any tips. He didn't say, try and do this, try and do that. He didn't give me any instruction on how to actually audiate music. And so I was kind of left to my own devices. I knew that the skill was possible to develop. I knew from anecdotal studies that other people had developed various degrees of audiation, and that they could actually hear certain aspects of their compositions in their mind, but I didn't know how to do it. And so that really set me on this quest to figure out how to audiate music and how to do it effectively. And so ever since then, I've been working on various exercises. I found some exercises that work. I found some exercises that are a waste of time. And it's not as simple as, if you go to a piano, play a G, hear that G back. If you're taking my Flawless course, you'll know that we do a little bit of audiation in there. And so if I play a G, I'll tell you to audiate it. But what you're doing when I play a note and then have you internalize it is you are actually just imitating the sound you've heard. A lot of us can do that to greater or lesser degrees. We've all had that experience, most likely, where you can't get a song out of your head. That's not audiation in the way that we want it to be for a composer. For a composer, we want to be able to actually create sounds in our head and know what those sounds are. Generally, if you play a single note, you can then hear that in your mind. If you think of a melody, a single line melody, you can hear that in your mind if you try and play it back. But when you start to try and hear harmonic intervals, something like that you can very clearly hear. A lot of you would probably know that's a major third in the external world. When you try and hear it internally, all of a sudden it becomes harder to know that that's truly a major third. And you may even have the experience where you hear that interval, or at least you think you hear it inside, but you're not sure. And so these are all things that I struggled with really since about 1996. And I've been working on a process over the decades to try and develop this ability to a greater degree. Because I had an early experience in college, which if you've watched some of my videos, I may have talked about this before. But I was essentially, some of the details are murky, but the important thing that I remember was I was sitting on the second floor of our university, and I heard what sounded like a wind symphony piece. And then I started to realize, oh, they're kind of playing my piece, and I knew I hadn't given them a piece I was working on. And so I was a little bit confused, and I started to think maybe, oh, I wrote a piece that already exists. And I started to get worried, but then I was like, no, there's no way this piece already exists. The harmonies and everything I'm using, they're too weird. It sounds too much like my music. And so upon investigation, I actually was confused. I realized that I was hearing that in my head in stunning quality. And that's what made me realize that you can audiate and hear things in real color. You can hear a full orchestra that sounds very real. But I have to caution you at this point. That is not a typical audiation experience. That's something that you may get a few times in your life if you're lucky, and it will be a very profound experience, but it's not something that you can develop to where you can just call it out at will. For most of us, you'll have to spend a lot of time working on lower levels of audiation. So for example, you might be able to hear in the beginning stages what sounds like kind of a fuzzy harmony. And then that fuzzy harmony, maybe the bass and the top line start to become clear, but you're still not really sure what's going on in the middle. And then eventually with more practice, those middle sounds will start to come through. But they're not like in the room with you. It's almost coming from sort of the back of your head. Typically, if you experience audiation, what I hear over and over again from students is that they hear it kind of from the left back side of their head. Why that is, I'm not sure. I think it's fascinating. Maybe a neurologist could tell us what's going on there, but they tend to hear it back here, almost behind the head. And so this is an experience that is really great if you can hear, an audiation where you hear a full symphony orchestra. What I discovered was there's that state, I think they call it a hypnagogic or a hypnagogic state, where you're going into sleep or you're coming out of it. And what happens is as you're going into sleep, you're kind of entering that space in between being very conscious and being asleep. And that's a very creative space. And in that space, you can actually audiate in a level that is very realistic. And so when I would compose early on, what I would do is I would get myself to that point where I was almost asleep, but I'd keep myself awake just so that I could play through particular parts in a composition. And so over time, I got better at that. But the problem with that state is you enter it to create, and then you have to leave it to write, because you can't write in that state. You typically have to have your eyes closed. And so these were all problems that I wrestled with, and eventually what I started discovering was that there are particular exercises that when done the correct way, process actually matters a lot. You can start to develop this ability to hear multiple independent lines internally. And a lot of composers can hear chord progressions internally, but when it comes to counterpoint and multiple independent lines kind of moving against each other, that's a lot harder. And so one of the things that I tried to do initially, I was taking a counterpoint course in graduate school, and I had read that, the traditional way to study counterpoint is to internalize the voices. And so I play them on the piano, and then I try and replicate what I heard on the piano internally. And what I discovered was that does not increase your ability to audiate. There is a process where the way that you approach hearing those particular intervals really matters, and it has to do with firmly understanding what the actual notes are that you're hearing before you hear them. So you have to create it in your mind. You can't simply take an exercise that exists and then hear it internally and expect that that will turn into your ability to audiate original music, but it is a starting point. And so there is a multi-stage process that you need to follow. You start with hearing individual notes, and then you start by trying to add a note on top of that. And then you start by trying to add like a drum track, things like this. And then from there, you continue to increase the complexity by taking external sounds and bringing them internal. And then eventually you reach a point where you have to get away from that and you have to actually start creating music. And so what I've done over the past couple decades here is I've actually created a process that worked for me first, and then I would use it with different people in small, isolated settings. I'd be like, hey, try this and let me know how it works for you. And they'd come back and be like, okay, my audiation's getting better. And now I'm teaching an audiation course, and I have several students in there, and they're reporting similar experiences where what was once impossible is now becoming easier. And so what this course is doing is it's creating a program that people can follow to really open up their ear. And so while you can do audiation exercises where you play a single note, you try and hear it, that's really only the tip of the iceberg. You really need to go much deeper into this, and you need to have the right approach to hearing. A lot of times what composers do is they'll say, well, I can play it on the piano. Or if it's too complex for me to play on the piano, I can put in a notation program and I can hear it that way. But these are all devices that are not flexible. There's nothing as flexible as being able to sit there and audiate particular sections to figure out where to go next in your music. And so this is why I'm teaching this course, because it's such an important skill for composers to have. It's going to make you more creative. It's going to allow you to write music much more quickly. It's also going to allow you to write music that really works. And so I think that's really important to note, is that unless you can sit there and kind of pace the music in your mind, hear it properly, and then put it out on paper in its perfect form, you're going to find that composition is much more difficult for you. I still firmly believe in this need to, once you've audiated and you put everything on the paper, that's when the editing begins, and that's when you look at what you have and you go through and you're like, okay, this note needs to change, this note needs to change, and you manipulate your composition after it's been written out. But even in that stage, you can sit there and look at the score and you can audiate what you're hearing. So the process is complex. It's not something that I could simply come in here and tell you, do this, then do this, then do this, because it requires a lot of failure. You have to fail over and over and over again. And I designed these incremental exercises that ensure the students fail at every single session. And what that does is the failure aspect of it actually triggers something in the mind where you're like, okay, I need to figure this out. And your mind gets to work on solving the skill you're trying to develop, which is audiation. And by continuing to give students that are progressively more difficult exercises, I'm able to increase this ability to hear multiple lines. So there's just a lot of information out there on audiation, and I think it's very important to try and figure out the correct way to do it. And so in this course, I kind of take you through a process. You have to kind of experience this journey on your own, right? But what I can tell you is when we start the exercises, there are certain exercises that are easy. It's important to have a little bit of success, but then there are certain exercises that are impossible. And they're just difficult enough that you'll be able to do maybe a quarter of them. Or I have one exercise that's about 35 minutes long, and nobody's gotten past about the fourth or fifth measure, but they are starting to hear more in the music they're listening to. And so what I want to talk about is when you're developing your audiation skills, there's a few stages you'll go through things that you'll notice in the outside world that tell you, okay, the audiation is starting to come. It's going to be something that I can develop. The first one, which you'll even notice on some level with the Flawless course, is you'll be listening to music that you've heard in the past. And all of a sudden you'll start to hear more voices that maybe weren't here before. You'll start to hear a rhythm that you never heard before in the composition. You'll start to hear a counter melody that comes out. You'll start to walk around the world and you'll hear more inflections in people's voices. So you'll hear it in the outside world first, that your pitch acuity and your sensitivity to sound is starting to increase. And that is a very necessary first step for developing audiation, because you have to fix your ear first. It doesn't mean you have to be able to say, okay, that's a perfect fifth, that's a perfect fourth, that's a major third. That helps. That is something that you want, but they're unrelated skills in a way, because audiation is simply about being able to hear and dissect what you're hearing inside. And then once you can dissect it, you can spend all day on the piano trying to figure out what it is. It's not like you immediately need to know that you just heard a perfect fifth. You can use kind of a hunt and peck technique to figure out what that fifth is. And that will eventually take you back into the ear training, and you'll get better at ear training as a result. So they complement each other, ear training and audiation, but they're not the same thing. And so that's kind of the first stage, is you start to notice differences in the world. And then you start to notice, oh, there was an exercise I did 3 weeks ago which I thought was impossible, and now I can hear it, right? So a lot of audiation and training the ear, it just has to do with trusting the process. Because as you continue to develop, as you continue to improve, you won't always realize that the thing that you can do now you couldn't do a week ago. But you will notice the thing you weren't able to do 4 weeks ago, you're able to do now. So it's kind of this progressive thing where you start to look back and you're like, oh, I'm really developing. And the whole process of audiation is just very beneficial if you're a composer. So I'm going to actually start doing this a little more regularly, and I'm going to have more sessions on this where I give you a little bit more information. But I wanted to start today just by talking about the fact that audiation is real. I have students ask me, can you really develop the ability to hear internally? Can you really look at a score and know what it sounds like before it's played? The answer is yes, and a little bit no. Because one of the things that audiation doesn't usually do is it doesn't take into account overtones. And overtones can really mess with things. Audiation also doesn't take into account human limitations. You're going to reach a point where, unless you're doing electronic music, what you audiate is just too difficult for an ensemble to play. Like, you might audiate something that's really quick and that's really fast, but when you hear it played, it doesn't work because the performers can't play it that fast. So little things like this can occur too, but this is also part of being a composer and learning what is possible for each instrument, for each ensemble. And so these are all things that are outside of audiation, but they're somewhat related, because just because you can audiate something doesn't mean it's going to sound perfect when you put it on paper. You still will likely to need to do some editing and things like that. So I wanted to start by just kind of introducing this process of audiation. I wanted to tell you that the way you approach something is so important. When I explain things in the Flawless course and I say do it this way, there's a reason for it. Because you can achieve a result in multiple ways. Here's a simple example. If I play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, right, and you've never heard that before, you can then sing that back most likely. You'll be able to sing it back because I played it for you. But if I give you the music and you can't immediately know that's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, then the process was missing, right? Because you don't have the ability to look at the music and know what it sounds like. But if I play it and you sing it back, That's not a problem, because what you're doing is you're using a process of rote memorization. I played it for you and you're imitating. So this is a simple example of how process matters, because often when we teach sight singing, students will go home, they'll memorize a melody, and they'll memorize it. They won't actually think about the interval relationships. They won't be able to read a new melody at sight, but they'll be able to perform one they've practiced well. So simply going home and taking a piece of music and then learning what it sounds like on the piano and then singing it doesn't make you better at sight singing. But sitting at a piano, giving yourself a starting pitch, and then voicing out each interval and trying to figure out what the melody sounds like without an external source does get you better at sight singing. So do you see there's a process and then there's a result? The person that memorizes by rote and the person that goes home and only takes their starting pitch and then figures out the other notes in relation to that, they will both be able to sing the melody at the end of the day. But the person who went home and used the process of, I'm not going to play this melody, I'm going to figure it out with my own ear, and the person that gets better at that, they're going to eventually going to be able to pick up a piece of music and say, this is what this sounds like. I know what it sounds like. So process is important, because you can achieve a result in multiple ways, but if you kind of cheat, you're going to get a result, but it's not going to help you develop as a musician. And it's the same thing with audiation. You have to approach it in the right way. You have to approach it with simple exercises. You have to approach it with additive exercises. You have to approach it with exercises that challenge you. You have to approach it with exercises that are going to frustrate you. If you're not frustrated while learning audiation, chances are you're not really going to learn it, because you're not pushing yourself enough. Audiation is one of those things where if you don't have a natural ability to do it, you really kind of have to shock the system. And so that's what this course aims to do. It aims to take ears that even are stubborn and open them up so that they can start to compose music, enjoy music, listen to music, and even just exist in the world in a completely different way. But today I talked a little bit about process. Maybe next time I'll give you a few exercises that you can work on to start to kind of develop this ability.